And we're live. It is Tuesday, January 21st, the year of many of our lords, 2025. 8 o'clock a.m. It is the first day of the apocalypse, first full day of the apocalypse. America under occupation, day one, coming to you from the seat of government, the center of the occupation, Washington, D.C. It's been less than a day, and we have already pardoned a whole bunch of insurrectionists, renamed the Gulf of Mexico, which is a reassuring thing because that was an injustice that needed to be undone. American troops are massing on the Canadian border to
Don't say that.
just to harass Alicia. It's one day down, 1,000 something or other to go. We're gonna put up a clock, a countdown clock, as well as a separate countdown clock for Canadian independence, which the thing is, we don't know when that's going to end. And for Greenland absorption, we're going to have countdown clocks for everything. But the key question is, how does it all look from Finland and from Sweden, sane countries where we don't elect Donald Trumps. So I thought we should talk to Minna today because that would be a way of killing a Finnish bird and a Swedish bird with one stone. We could bring her in. Her last name says Sweden, even though she's not Swedish. She's in Stockholm, even though she's not Swedish, but she speaks for Finland, all of Finland. And of course, she antagonizes Germans. She also has a new Substack, which, as I said on the newsletter last night, I added it to my list of recommendations, and I did that because I, in fact, recommend it. So you should subscribe to Minna Ålander's new podcast. Welcome back to the show, Minna. How dumb and crazy do we look from across the
I've only so far managed to write one post, and it took me 4 months or so. Well, maybe not quite, 3. 3 months after I set up the Substack. So I can't promise any very frequent updates, but let's see. Maybe I'll get the hang of it.
How long was I your only subscriber for?
You weren't quite the only one, but I thought that it was really touching. Yeah, exactly. I thought that it was really touching that some people did subscribe to it, although nothing happened for such a long time. Not just friends, but a couple of people also from I think Blue Sky or Twitter or something.
Any German haters? Minna is for those of you who don't get this joke, Minna has a whole group of people on Twitter who think she is a one-woman anti-German, I don't know, so Minna lived in Germany for a long time and speaks near native German. And has a way of antagonizing the entire nation of Germany. The only other person I've ever seen like this is Rick Grinnell, who is a raging asshole, which Minna is not. And so if you want to study how to antagonize the entire Federal Republic of Germany without being a raging asshole, Minna is is a master class in this.
You tend to get your recycling not air the apartment regularly or something. That's also another sure way to that too. You can't just
too much noise on Sunday.
Glass bottles whenever. It's within certain periods of time. I could go on, but I mean, now I'm a little concerned about this, like Rick Grenell comparison. That's not a good company to be in, so maybe I should.
No, no, no. Yeah, I don't know. Just to be clear, um, the point of that was that Minna does it while being nice and funny and interesting, while not being a raging asshole.
The
Oh,
chat wants us to say what the Substack name is
so
called
like
on air
my
so it's in
handle
Oh,
YouTube
there
good
is
later.
point.
Minna Lander, so like just together Min A Lander. Um, but the Substack is called Northern Flank Notes. Sorry, it sounds kind of stupid, but I just couldn't come up with anything better for the time being, so let's see. Um,
It's great.
And it is recommended on Dogshirt Daily. So if you have any trouble finding it, just go to Dogshirt Daily, which I know you subscribe to because you're here, and just go to the recommendations, and it will direct you directly to Northern Flank Notes because
thanks.
I
That
do,
makes it
in
easier.
fact, recommend it. Um,
I mean, I
all right,
don't
so
know
how
whether
stupid
it
do we
looks more
look?
stupid or just like sort of sad. Um, I personally don't know what to feel. Like, I have to also admit that I didn't follow like the inauguration, and I just like sort of I decided like not today Satan, you know. It was the same for me when it was the election night in Europe. Like a lot of people just stayed up to wait for the result, and I was like, I have a bad gut feeling about this, so I'm definitely going to go to bed and not stay up all night for the potentially bad news. So I had like kind of a similar feeling yesterday that like I mean listening to any sort of like European news or like reading European news for the past I don't know 6 to 12 months has been like literally the same thing every time. Like, what of all of these crazy things is he really going to do? Like, what does this mean? Like, how far will this go? And I was like listening to this again on Sunday for like the 250th time, and I was like, okay, like, why do we have this on the news like every day? I mean, let's just like wait and see. Basically, I have this feeling that we just have to wait and see. It's hard to tell like to what extent he likes to bluster, like this whole Greenland stuff. Of course, like was the most like disconcerting for us Europeans. The fact that it actually caused a genuine like and pretty big foreign policy crisis in Denmark. Um, so I don't know, like it's sort of it'll be interesting to see whether he follows up on this stuff now that he in fact is in power. Like, is it just that he likes to stir it up and see us panic and like you know like see that impact and effect, and then it gets kind of boring when he would actually like have to do something about it or like implement it. I don't know. I'm like very far from any sort of like Trump whisperer, so um, what I think is concerning from the European perspective is this sort of like historical analogy, especially with these pardons for the January 6th people that I it is like one of
So
the
how much
things
attention
like
is
I
that
think
getting?
somewhat less than in the US, because that's of course like in terms of also like I don't know like the situation domestic. Yeah, it's like I mean obviously like
It's not
we
a
do
foreign
follow like
policy matter.
everything that happens in the US, but I think that's maybe like a little bit more or even more sort of like a domestic issue in some ways. But there is this like uncanny sort of parallel
Right.
to what I think that Hitler did the same when he came to power. Like he pardoned a bunch of people as well back then. So it's just like uncanny in many ways. I'm like not making that comparison, but it's just like there are like so many sort of I mean,
Of course.
like, we've been there, we've done that in Europe, and like, we of course would have wished for the US to not repeat our mistakes. But maybe this is also like a new and genuinely like American mistake. I don't know. But so what's the view sort of? There's of course been a lot of like sort of disturbing sane washing going on, which a lot of people feel more or less disgusted about. But then on the other hand, what are you going to do if you are a European government? Like, you can't go out there and just like pick a fight with
Right.
him right away. Like, that's just like, it is a very genuine diplomatic sort of challenge how to deal with him. I just started reading an FT op-ed by, I think it was Ivan Krastev, who wrote something like that the Europeans shouldn't immediately start appeasing Trump, but rather just like be clear about our interests and sort of confuse him back. And that the most confusing thing for him would be if Europeans were assertive about their own interests and their own place in the world. Uh,
And how plausible do you think that is? Because to say that's sort of easy to say if you're, Macron but if you're Brussels, and you've got 23 countries that
27.
have to agree by
It's even more.
consensus and,
Yeah.
being a cert 27, sorry, you keep adding them. Um, you know, you have it's kind of
Mm.
easy to talk about European unity, but it's actually really hard to do. And particularly in the security and, well, I guess it's easier in the trade sector where Europe negotiates as a bloc, but in the security sphere, you know, when it's kind of much more easily talked about than done. Do you
So,
think it's a
like,
plausible thing?
multiple things can be true at the same time. Like, there's been a lot of talk about this beauty contest that is very likely to kick off among the European countries to sort of like try and bilateralize a relationship with the US and try to sort of like present your country in a better light than other European countries and be like, look, I don't know, we're spending more on defense than like I don't know who, and like we're doing this and we're like, it's of course like sort of a tempting strategy. I think that it would be probably more efficient and effective if the Europeans manage to find at least some kind of a common least common denominator or something, and sort of try to leverage some form of sort of like group, like the weight of the group instead of like just every single little country trying to sort of like play its own game. I'm like, what does Trump care about Finland? Like he might still remember that Finland exists because he visited last time, but like who knows? So this is just like such an unequal game for the European countries that like it's extremely hard there to like go into it alone, and like we would really need more of a European team. However, I did mention that I believe that multiple things can exist or multiple strategies can exist at the same time. So I've been asked previously, like what I think about what is more likely that Europeans will come together, for example, for the aid of Ukraine and continue helping Ukraine, supporting Ukraine with or without the US, or whether exactly this kind of whether everything will just like fall apart and Europeans will just all like go after their own like national interests and so on. I think that both might happen, sort of. Like in terms of the rest of the relations, the European countries might very well sort of like try and go into this beauty contest. But on the other hand, I also believe that the European countries are going to step up, at least some of them, and keep supporting Ukraine. So if we look at Northern Europe, a lot of Northern European countries have made like investments into Ukrainian defense industrial base, which is really important in the long run. There's a lot of joint ventures. There's a lot of like long-term programs. Like Norway just recently smashed quite a big like aid package, like a long-term until 2030s on the table, like making Norway like one of the biggest European donors. So there's a lot of these things going on, which I think is like really important. This has to be a genuinely European responsibility, of course. So this is sort of like I think that both is going to happen to an extent. Um, and then sort of like when we think about like what would it take for a European interest to emerge? Well, that depends on how bad it gets, of course, right? There is, of course, like some kind of a scenario where Trump goes so far with like Greenland and whatever, and with his tech bros that it just reaches such an like unacceptable sort of level for Europeans that I mean, like the EU is actually mastering muddling through crisis, and that's just like something where this kind of that when you're really threatened, when the whole sort of European, like however vague it may be, but when the European interest is seriously threatened, like really often there is like this reaction that Europe somehow gets the act together rather than falls apart so far. So I'm not too, yeah, I
Right.
mean,
Except with Britain.
Control Britain.
Well, I mean, I mean, Europe does reach breaking points, and it.
To be fair, the English don't think they're European.
Well, fine. Neither does Trump. And I mean, I do think Europe. One of the ways it is a master of controlling situations is by defining which situations it actually plausibly has control over. And it didn't end up pleading for the UK to stay in, and when it negotiated the exit, it negotiated really tough, and it kicked London's ass in the exit negotiations. And I think it's actually a good sign of when it when it plays hardball and when it plays softball consensus. The UK
yeah,
got
I mean, like
nothing
I
in
think that
those
there's a consensus at this point that
negotiations.
it wasn't such a great idea. But so I think that it is in that sense an interesting example that it didn't break up Europe on the whole. And actually, the UK is still, yeah,
Right. Grexit never happened. The Italians, they've absorbed Meloni like
mhm.
she's a social democrat or something. They're really masters at rolling with punches and co-opting things that shouldn't be able to be absorbable and making them kind of normal.
Are they though? Like, just because it didn't happen now doesn't mean it's not happening with how many governments have been falling to right-leaning
I'm not saying it I'm
politicians.
not saying it's not under stress. It's clearly under stress. I'm saying if you had predicted that Silvio Berlusconi would come and go, Giorgia Meloni,
The herpes of
you know,
politics.
she'll be just another Ukraine supporting NATO member who doesn't like LGBT people, and that you know uh, Slovakia and Hungary can have you know neo-authoritarian quasi Putin loving leaders, and Europe will just kind of chug along. This is incredible diversity that the European Union has managed. Oh, and it can outlive law and justice in Poland, and eventually Polish people will come to their senses and install a nice Donald Tusky government, and will still be there doing Europe things when Poland comes back to its senses. I mean, it's been very impressive.
You're very optimistic. Um, I wonder, and maybe you can speak to this, Minna. I think that the current cabinet is a lot more conservative than the last cabinet, and maybe taking different stances, especially on things like tech regulation or how it should be enforced. Do you think that that will have any bearing on
So
how
just maybe one
Europe
quick
collectively
point
responds
to
to Trump?
Ben's optimism. I just read an op-ed by Caroline de Gruyter, and sorry, I just completely mispronounced her name because I don't know Dutch, but she's a Dutch journalist, and she wrote an op-ed in Foreign Policy, basically making the argument that, or the claim that Europe's biggest problem is pessimism, and that Europeans should be more possibilist. And I kind of like that. She also pointed out that like European citizens are now more positive about the EU membership than they were. So now it's like somewhere around, like on average, like 70% or something of EU citizens actually think that their country's EU membership is a good thing. And I think that this was also an interesting development after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, that you would see it also in a country like Finland, that that people were like not complaining about the EU anymore as much, and sort of like that there was this like clear like coming back to the basics moment of like, yeah, actually it's a really good thing to be part of this bigger thing. It's very interesting. Orban isn't anti-EU. Like EU is like his best leverage that he has. Like it's his arena where he can like play his veto and be the strong guy. Like nobody would otherwise care about him, you know? So he actually really depends on the EU for being able to like have this kind of like position. So
What?
mm,
Well, I think we should have a new slogan for Europe.
I
It's
like that.
"Make
I like that.
Europe Optimistic Again." Meow. And I think you should run for European
Yeah, I mean,
Parliament
like
as part of the
politics,
Meow
like
Party.
not for me, but this is very tempting, I have to admit. There have been definitely weirder parties in the European Parliament, so in that sense, yeah,
Yeah,
like
I think
that would
and
definitely
Meow's
would be
got an
catchy.
obvious
Like it
slogan
might
here.
get some votes.
You can get just a big cat face as the symbol of the party, some kind of
Yeah.
minimalist cat. Um,
So, but your point was,
Alicia?
Alicia, that it's still like sort of a concerning like what like where this might be going now that Europe is maybe getting more, that there is sort of like this sort of conservative backsliding from the sort of very liberal type of democracy. That's true, and I think that it's precisely this interesting thing that the European Union in itself, as an organization, as a thing, a phenomenon, can like outlast these shifts, but it of course will affect sort of the politics and maybe to an extent also policy and polity. Um, it's always the question how much is like on the intergovernmental level and how much is supranational. So I don't think that there's like a whole lot of appetite to sort of pool more sovereignty at the moment. That's for sure one thing. And then that this like tech question is actually incredibly interesting, precisely with regard to the US and how Europe might react. So at what point? I mean, there has been sort of like this emerging fight, like EU versus the tech bros. And now that also Mark Zuckerberg sort of like decided to join the Trump camp, I mean, I guess this was already like coming for some time. But still, it will be interesting to see because that's exactly an arena where the EU has considerable power. So I'm sort of like waiting and like I'm curious to see whether at some point there will be this sort of Palpatine moment of unleashing unlimited regulatory power and like sort of going all out there and like making life genuinely hard for like Musk and Zuckerberg and stuff. Um, so that is one thing that could happen. Mm,
It's actually a really interesting point because it's an area where European and American sensibilities, regulatory sensibilities,
yeah,
are at a median level quite different. So even a normal American administration has a less regulatory approach to big tech than Europe does, which is, as a result of it, there
yeah,
are
that's true.
no European tech giants. They're all American companies, or in some cases Chinese companies, but there's no European big tech industry. There are startups like Skype that get sold to American businesses, and there are kind of mid-sized companies that mostly do domestic service in European countries, but all of the big children are American, and the result is that if you confine it to the European to the tech sector, Europe actually has the ability to regulate American businesses in a fashion that the U.S. can't then turn around and uh, meaningfully retaliate against because it's just an area where there are no giant European players. And so the result is that you end up with a kind of asymmetric, uh, I would say, disadvantage from the European population standpoint because the industry is all in Silicon Valley, but advantage from a regulatory standpoint. And when the U.S. wants to retaliate,
Yeah.
it has to
Which it
retaliate
can, of
in
course,
areas
do, like
other
in
than
trade or
tech.
something. Yeah.
More,
Yeah.
more, which it can and does do, but it's an area where Europe has a significant negotiating leverage, partly because it has genuinely, and I mean these are not values that I share, and so I'm if I were European, I would be quite critical of it. But I'm not. And so I can be kind of admiring of it. Europe has said, look, we will give up having a thriving big tech sector because we believe in things like privacy um, and the result is actually a fairly impressive um, commitment to that over 25 years, and it's caused real damage in some ways to European innovation and all kinds of things, but it really does end up with a, you know,
Yeah.
they have lived their values on this stuff.
Except I think that that's changing. The idea of that there's been a bigger wave of people who are saying GDPR is holding us back in tech innovation and we need to remove these types of regulations. Then you have the Draghi report out next year, and I think that we may see in this cabinet a switch towards being more tech friendly with
That's
the
of course
desire for
possible
fewer
because if
rules
you
to
do sort of
innovate in
like
Europe.
regulatorily cut off
Well,
some US tech apps and stuff, then you need to offer an alternative in a way.
how has the
Well,
TikTok
I guess
thing
we
been received in Europe? So I imagine from a
yes.
European perspective, this must be super confusing. You have Congress pass a law, you have the law go into effect the day before the new administration takes office, you have the administration come in and saying we're not going to enforce that law, and you have
Yeah, it's like
Apple and
confusing to
Google
say the least.
enforcing
And
it
like,
anyway.
I'm not on TikTok, so I don't know whether it is like, but I saw some screenshots of TikTok sort of like thanking Trump for like restoring it or something like that. And if those were like genuine, then that's of course like a really good trick for Trump, how to like generate, I don't know, support among young people or whatever. Yeah. So
Among teenagers.
I don't know. It's sort of so since I didn't watch the inauguration ceremony, I don't know whether the CEO of TikTok was indeed there. But I think last week there were some rumors that he was at least invited. So
Like he was sat next to the incoming director of national
well,
intelligence.
that's
Is that?
Is that right?
I
yeah.
don't know anymore. I feel like everything I see online
Yeah,
isn't
I
real.
mean,
This is a bad
so
spiral.
that's
Sorry,
like
Minna.
obvious. So, like after this having been such a hot topic for like such a long time, then that's like a weird move, you know. So then there was sort of this like, okay, we thought that he would be hawkish on China. Apparently he won't. And there is then this like question like, whose interest does he represent? Like, what is his interest? Like, is it just representing the Trump interest? Like, is there something like America still out there, or is it just like him and like whatever? So I don't know. Um, I just today actually I picked up a package
So
from like a small shop, and the person at the shop was like, you know, like I think Trump is gonna like fix everything. Like he's a businessman, he's gonna fix everything. And I was like, yeah, that's one view,
that's
exactly.
what I
So
think. Make
Yeah.
America great again. Make Europe optimistic again.
Mm.
But this is the whole Carvin thought, right? Like that if you want something to succeed and be efficient, that the best model is a corporation running it. I think we're all just headed into snow crash.
All right, so here's the next question, which is it colder in Stockholm or uh, or near Ottawa or in Washington D.C. right now? Because I was in Minneapolis yesterday, and it was you know negative 23 degrees Celsius. So I think I probably have you all beat.
Well, it's
But
like
Minna, what's
some
the
degrees
temperature where
plus
you are?
Celsius, so it's been very warm and all the snow melt, and it's like very sad at the moment.
Oh,
I'm winning. I'm winning this game.
what's the temperature in Ottawa?
Oh,
It
nice.
is minus 18. Um,
You got me beat.
but
Um,
that's where I am. Ottawa was like feels
So
like
that's
minus
Celsius, right?
25. It was minus 20 this morning.
wow. John Hawkinson, what's the temperature
Yeah, of
where you
course. I
are?
don't know Fahrenheit.
Well, I'm in New York, Ben, and I think it's 8 degrees here, allegedly.
Yeah, that's what it is here too.
It's a shame how the East Coast is so compressed. I have a domestic question. I don't want to derail things, so I can wait or.
No, no, go ahead.
Well, so I wanted to ask about litigation. And in case you hadn't heard, by the way, I'm sorry to let you know, Ben, that Charlie Savage has beat you to the punch, and he and the New York Times sued DOJ under FOIA regarding the classified documents Jack Smith report this
Good. I'm
morning,
glad. I'm happy to let the New York Times pay for the litigation.
12:07 a.m. Uh, but I am a little puzzled why all of this litigation, of which so far I can count to seven, and maybe there's more and maybe there's less, has been sort of clocked against yesterday. It seems to me like the FOIA litigation and the FACA litigation that DOJ is an illegal committee, those are cases that could have, in most cases, been filed earlier. I don't know that they would have proceeded meaningfully because, there are all these delays, time to serve, time for answers, all that crap. But it feels like they could have been filed before yesterday. And yet we got a spate of four cases in DC at like 2 minutes after 12, which I,
Right.
I can't really tell if they actually waited for Trump to swear or not swear. But it was striking how close they all were together. And then a bunch later. And so there's some kind of, I think, political signaling, but I just don't understand. And in fact, it seems like it might be advantageous to have filed some of these things, especially the FOIA ones, still under Biden's DOJ or Garland's DOJ. So I'm curious if there are any thoughts about that.
All right. So I would say the FOIA and the FACA litigations are differently situated for that purpose. And without criticizing the New York Times or its counsel, I would say they probably jumped the gun on that
Oh,
one.
actually, the Times was the one exception to that. There's a 10-day rule on getting a determination on expedited processing, and that fell over the weekend. So they are actually the one where today was the first business day.
Right. No, no, understood. But I still think they jumped the gun. And the reason is if the if the cases against Nauta and De Oliveira are still pending, and I assume they will be dismissed today, but I don't doubt that a FOIA exemption applies while those cases are pending. It involves, pending litigation. It's blah blah blah. And so my view is the triggering event is the dropping of that litigation. And so the reason for the secrecy of the final report goes away, not the change in administration. Now, the change in the administration does bring about the dropping of the litigation, but it seems to me the FOIA threshold is the dropping of the litigation, not the change of administration. So I wouldn't bring the case until the litigation is gone. That said, I am more than happy for the New York Times to pay for the litigation rather than lawfare or me personally. And so I have no competitive urge to be the one who forces the release of the document as long as somebody is doing it.
You could imagine in that case even that there was a concern that if there was no litigation pending when the cases were dropped, that someone would say that they could just delete the document. I know that's far-fetched, and
I don't think it is that far-fetched, actually. I mean, the desire to have a request in to preclude destruction of material is a reasonably prudent thing. And I was one of the reasons I put it in. And now, generally speaking, you're not allowed to destroy matters that are things that are supposed to go to the archive. And there are rules just preserving regular government documents. But I think there's a matter of prudence, having a request in for it was a smart idea on the part of the New York Times, and frankly on whoever else, including me, did it. So the FACA litigation is different. The FACA litigation, I don't think, can be filed until Doge exists as a quasi-government entity.
will it ever?
Well, it certainly doesn't under the Biden administration, right? But the moment there is a private entity that is advising the president or advising the government, you do have this very fair question of whether and how it does or doesn't have to comply with FACA. And so that's why I think all of these groups wait until the moment that there is a Trump administration.
So I only read a couple of them, and I guess you always have to take complaints with a grain of salt. But it seems like there was substantial interaction between OMB and Doge, even under the Biden administration, or at least so that was what was alleged.
Right, but the Biden administration did not constitute Doge, right? And so if you're setting up a committee in order to advise the federal government, there's a question about whether FACA applies. And for those who don't know, FACA is the Federal Advisory Committee Act. But if some organization constitutes itself and writes a letter to OMB, that's not a FACA committee, right? And so the moment it has some kind of official status, you have a FACA question. All right, so I don't want to derail the entire conversation on this. So back to Europe for us. Minna, how much... have there been any early signs from the administration on things that, like, other than Greenland and trade and stuff, on the core security issues? Were there any first day signs that
obviously they
people
started
in
already a
Europe
year ago
noticed?
when Trump said that he would only defend the countries that spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense, and with the rest he would let Russia do whatever they want. So as far as I've seen in the media, like, he didn't at least sign any decrees immediately about leaving NATO or something. But obviously we all know that that's not the real sort of issue here, but just like how much damage he can do without actually sort of like leaving NATO. And one of the biggest threats here is precisely that kind of statements, like that a year ago about this 2%, about making the extended nuclear deterrence that America offers its allies conditional. So that already sort of creates doubts and sort of this kind of question about whether it actually holds or not. That is already in itself very bad for the credibility of the deterrent. And as we know, deterrence is mostly psychological, so that's sort of not great. So that's of course.
And
I
have
think
we
like it
heard
was
anything
interesting
from
to see what
Russia?
Russia commented on the Greenland thing. They were sort of like, "Oh, this is very concerning, and like this is quite unacceptable to like threaten somebody like this." Yeah.
Yeah, the
Because who could
inadmissibility
ever?
of the the
Absolutely.
sacrosanct nature
But what was more
of
concerning was that like
borders.
if
Ooh.
the US were to invade Greenland, then they would have to reconsider their position on Svalbard is like something that I sort of noticed. And so that's of course like
Okay, so for those who are not Svalbard
right. So
experts here,
Svalbard is this like
give us
extremely
the little
northern
briefing
archipelago.
because
It belongs
uh,
to Norway. It's under Norwegian sovereignty, but it's quite a special place. It's like quite far away from the Norwegian mainland, and it's very cold out there. You always need to have a rifle with you just in case that you encounter a polar bear. So this is actually not a joke. And there's this. Yeah,
and
basically, I mean, so there's the
anybody in the
Svalbard
world
Treaty
can live
that
there without a visa,
regulates
right?
these islands, and when those treaties were signed, for example, so one part of it is that any nation can have commercial activity there, and has the right to it. However, it's only Russia and Norway who have commercial activity there, and there's been like some tensions with those like Russian communities on Svalbard recently with some absurd military parades, like military style parades that they've been holding on the Victory Day, the 9th of May and stuff. And China has a research station there, which is also sort of like a somewhat suspicious entity. And yeah, so that's, well, I
And
mean,
why does Norway tolerate this? I mean, Finland doesn't have Russian commercial activity and Chinese research bases in the area that you grew up in. Why is Norway
well, I mean, it's not strictly speaking, it's
hosting
not military
Russian
because
military
Svalbard is, of course,
parades?
demilitarized. However, it's like always the question, like to what extent. Yeah. So it's always a question like to
Military
what extent
style.
like this Chinese research station is really doing the research just for the overall advancement of the human civilization, and like whether they have other interests there, or like also the because like Russia is known to use these little green man tactics and stuff like that. But so why Norway has to tolerate it is this Svalbard Treaty. And now I have not read it, so I can't like explain to you all the details and the process and everything. But that stipulates that there is this right, so that it's like it's under Norwegian authority sovereignty, but it is this kind of like different place in terms of international law than the rest of Norway's territory, where other nations who are the signatories of this treaty have the right to pursue commercial activity. So this, it's like,
And when does the
yes,
Svalbard
so it
Treaty
was,
date from?
yeah.
Do you know?
Well, thanks for looking it up because I would
1920.
have guessed something like that, but like about
Wow,
100 years
it's
ago.
old.
Yeah.
I had to
Great. So
Google.
now you
You got
can
to
tell us
talk
all
while I
about
was like,
Svalbard
cool, I'll
Treaty.
find some more
But
information.
so I've also been like kind of intrigued by like when will Trump, like what if Trump finds out about Svalbard? Like is he gonna be like yeah,
The U.S.
They're
needs it, right?
signatory.
No, no. Here's why why Trump will not care about the Svalbard Treaty, because it's not Svalbard isn't big. The reason he's
mm,
attracted to Greenland is that it is large, and if you
yeah,
acquired Greenland, the United States would be bigger.
Does he want
Um,
us because we're bigger than you guys?
I think so. Yeah, it's
yeah.
because big.
Why doesn't he make a play for Russia? Come on,
He
bigger.
cares about big, um, big and bullyable. And there just aren't that many countries that are
I
big and
guess.
bullyable.
Mm,
Um, I mean, there's like, I, I, I
mm.
think it's amazing that he hasn't noticed Brazil.
Is it bullyable? I feel like I wouldn't want to take Brazil on.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's not, it's more apt to be culturally defiant than you guys are, but, but I wouldn't, I wouldn't want to be the Brazilian military that had to defend it.
Right.
Right. And so,
Hello. When was the last war you guys won?
it
I mean,
depends what you
technically,
mean by
the US
war.
hasn't declared a war for like how
And it
long?
also
Like more than
depends,
100 years? Yeah.
well, neither has anybody else since 1945. Yeah, so,
Wait, wasn't
yeah,
war
I
declared
think
in the
Svalbard's pretty
Falkland
safe.
Islands War? Yeah. Yeah, right?
That was the
No,
Brits.
yeah,
It
Mm.
was a war. And
I
that was
don't,
the last war they won. I mean,
yeah,
the Brits, not the
I just,
Americans.
I just want to say that the concept of fighting and winning wars is, um, is like the United States is extremely good at fighting and winning battles, but it is very bad over the last bunch of years at sustained political victory as a result of the battles that it wins. And um, which is why, in fact, absorbing Canada is unthinkable, because you could do the initial invasion, that's not a problem, but how do you hold it? We'd be
Our
terrible at
passive
that.
aggression would just wear you down over time.
Exactly. It's like we barely hold Minnesota, because like the passive aggression no, you guys,
Actually,
Ontario would
related to
be
this, like, there were some
impossible.
discussions,
Um,
like, halfway serious. Like, what do we do if the US does, like, a Crimea annexation scenario on Greenland? Because the US has bases there. Like, what do we do then?
yeah.
Europe, yeah.
So
Europeans.
who's the we here?
But
Europe
mainly
or
Denmark,
or
obviously. Then, like, this somewhat concerns also other Nordic countries because we
I
tend to sort of, like, care about each other. And then, yeah, but that's different. And
right,
it's more like
only
about ice
except
hockey
in
and
soccer matches.
cross-country skiing, actually. But anyways, so there was actually, it was really interesting how the French foreign minister was making some statements about Greenland and how like French would like come to Greenland's defense. And that actually prompted a Swedish Blue Sky user to make a very beautiful new edition of this old. So in the Finnish Winter War, there was this poster in Sweden of like two guys skiing, and one was like Finland, one was Sweden, and like there was this slogan about like volunteering to go and help Finland fight this war against the Soviet Union, and somebody made this, and it said like Finland's cause is ours, volunteer for the Corps, Finland Corps. And then somebody made this kind of new edition of it with like a French and a Danish guy, and it said in French, Denmark's cause is ours, and it was like really hilarious. But so that was interesting. It was of course an incredibly French flex to like immediately go
And
out and sort of make that statement. But then also like some EU spokesperson, because like the question was like the EU has also this sort of security. It's not a security guarantee because there's nothing behind it. It's just like a nice sounding article. But there is in the Lisbon Treaty, there is this article 42.7, and it actually like the question was like, does this apply to Greenland? Because Greenland is part of like one of the constituents of the Kingdom of Denmark, but it's actually not an EU member. And then like some EU spokesperson, I'd have to double check who it was because this was a couple of weeks ago. But they said that yes, they would consider this to apply to Greenland. So if Denmark wanted to sort of like invoke this, that would be a valid thing to do. So I thought that was sort of interesting. Um,
and do we have a sense? I mean, um I have not taken this seriously in the sense that, Trump made noises about this before in the first term, never did a thing. Um, it was, as best as I can tell, a combination of personal grandiosity on his part and an effort to rattle European cages. Do you have a sense of how seriously this? I mean, it did
yeah.
seem to provoke a political crisis in Denmark. Um, what was the nature of that, and are people taking this seriously as a as a possible significant foreign policy objective of the new administration?
Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister of Denmark, spoke on the phone with Trump last week, and it seems to have been a not very nice conversation. There had apparently also been some back-channel signaling from Trump's people that like Denmark shouldn't dismiss this and that it would be very unwise to react like last time when Mette Frederiksen just said that this is absurd, and then Trump was butthurt and didn't come to Denmark on a state visit that had been planned. So it seems that there was like so they were like seriously sort of like putting up the heat on Denmark last week. But then, like as I said in the very beginning of this this conversation, like it's hard to tell. Like, did he just like the bluster before he was in office, sort of like stirring us up and making us panic and like see us sort of like get nervous? Like, was that just like the effect that he wanted to have? Is he gonna follow up on this now, or is it sort of like boring now that there's like a real chance of implementing it? I don't know. Hard to tell. So I would say that we will see like if he takes it up again or not. Like if he takes it up again now that he is actually in power, like I don't know, that might make a difference. Yeah, so I don't know. It's very hard to tell at the moment how to sort of what to feel about all this. And of course, like one of the issues is like I was talking about this like beauty contest between European countries earlier, but the biggest challenge is also that it's very lucrative for European politicians to score domestic points based on like their stance with Trump, like either by sort of presenting themselves as somebody who can deal with him, or if that's more politically expedient, to present themselves as somebody who will be tough with Trump. So this is also something we've already seen it featured to an extent in the German election campaign, where like Olaf Scholz, the current still like sitting chancellor, was trying to sort of like present himself as like saying like talking about Europe and like this Greenland thing as a threat to European interests, like that this European interest that we talked about earlier, whatever it is. So it is like this is also one thing that is very tempting. And then there's of course this question about like European conservative parties and whether they still think that the Republican Party is the party of Reagan, which it isn't. And here I thought it was very interesting that in Sweden, the Sweden Democrats, the far right party, MAGA was like they were too much even for them. So they were like on some kind of fact-finding mission in the U.S., like meeting with MAGA Republicans and Trumpists, and they came back and were like, whoa, this was weird. Like this goes too far.
So what is
well, I mean, like one interesting thing actually, unfortunately, that is sort of that Trump and several European governments have in common, is that there's an increase in talk, for example, also in Sweden about and this is not only driven by the Sweden Democrats, I have to say, about sort of withdrawing citizenship for people who have acquired the citizenship in some recent time frame and have been engaged in and convicted for organized crime, like crime on the level that threatens the Swedish sort of like state and system. So there has been an actual discussion on this. Also, that the probably next Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, was saying something similar. So there's this whole talk about like revoking citizenship, not only in the U.S. but also in Europe, which is like to me pretty concerning. That this is sort of like the discourse, and there you really see, because this is also coming from the more moderate conservative parties that are supposed to be more in the center. So here you see how they are also like adopting these say far right narratives and alternatives. So in Sweden the situation is quite interesting because the Sweden Democrats are not in the government, but the government depends on them and their sort of like votes in the parliament for majority.
And
yeah, exactly.
And
so,
they are the
they
largest
actually got
party
the
or the
most
second
votes,
largest
last
party
time.
now? So, Alicia, what about in Canada now? Are we seeing the Greenland thing as the pointy end of the spear, or is Canada, in its relentless focus on Canada, seeing just sort of ignoring the Greenland thing and seeing the threat as, you guys are first?
No, I wouldn't. Yeah, we're not the latter. I even just yesterday I was forced by CBC to listen to the inauguration speech live, um,
Why did you
in the
do
car
that?
because it was in the car and it was playing and it was already playing, and then I was like, well, now I'm
You
in
know,
it,
you could
and
turn on music, you
I
could
just
turn on
I can't
white
stop.
noise. You you
Like
you
I
you don't do that
just
to yourself,
I
Alicia. The
couldn't
sound of his voice
I just
is
couldn't look
is dangerous.
couldn't turn away. I it's I'm fascinated. I'm gonna have to get offline entirely. The okay, so I feel like in Canada what happens is we listen to all of it, right? So like if you're following CBC or anything, like we're not just picking out single issues, because I think we may be a little bit more aware that we are pretty interconnected with a lot of things, not just the US, but like what happens in Greenland is a precursor of what might happen to us. We're also paying attention to what he's saying about Panama because, again, depending on what he does somewhere, it may be an indication of what he's prepared to do to us. I do think what I'm really worried about, though, for all of us, Europe, everybody who he's talking about, Panama, et cetera, is that we're not being very strategic. We're being very reactive. So we're looking at what he's saying, and now not just like Germany, but our premier in Ontario is trying to push for an election because he's claiming that he needs a strong mandate from the electorate to go after Trump. The federal election, which will
This is the
happen sometime this
Trumpy
year.
Premier of Ontario,
Yes,
Doug
yes,
Ford, who's,
yes.
if that last name means anything to you, that is because his brother was the famous crack
Crack
smoking
smoking mayor of
mayor of
Toronto. Thank you for
Toronto.
reminding us.
Well, I mean, look, I'm from DC where we had our own crack smoking mayor. So I think this bonds Toronto and DC, sister cities.
Right. Yeah. So yes, he's there and he's been there for a while, but yeah, he's taking a hard stance, but he's trying to force an election or threatening an election to get a stronger mandate. So what I worry about is that if our politicians are very much reacting to Trump, we're not really thinking long term, and we haven't been for a while. So I'm gonna like this is uncharacteristic of me, and I don't actually have hope for this, but I'll reserve a tiny bit of optimism that maybe this makes us think a little bit differently about how we go about our international relations, diversifying some of our trade deals, and also maybe trying to think a little bit farther than the next election.
All right, we got to wrap up because we have 2 minutes and 29 seconds left. But Minna Ålander, first of all, as I have said to many a prior guest, once you've been on Dog Shirt TV, you are welcome to show up anytime, announced or unannounced, to co-host, to participate in the discussion. That link you have will always work, so use it liberally. Um, uh,
Thank you.
Everybody subscribe to Northern Flank Notes. We are going to be back tomorrow for day 2 of America Under Siege, Under Occupation, the Apocalypse, whatever you want to call it. Hey, it's Dog Shirt TV. It's a revolution in morning television. I don't know who our guest is going to be tomorrow, but, we may be talking about pardons for January 6ers. As you know, I have some friends who know something about those January 6th cases, having sat through a bunch of them. So, maybe I'll see if Roger Parloff wants to join us, or maybe some fresh hell will be unloosed upon us today that will require discussion tomorrow. I, noticed that those civil service EOs we're still waiting for those. And so, we got lots of options. The FBI is under the management of some rando who's been in office for 6 days in Newark. Who knew? And so you never know what's coming down the pike. And of course, American troops are massing on the shores of Greenland in offshore what are the boats, you know, and so the invasion of Greenland could begin at any time. And Alicia, of course, is standing there with her AK-47 in the
We're not allowed to
frozen
have those.
frozen north, no, issued by the Canadian government to protect, it's sort of like a home defense situation to protect against the invasion of southern Ontario. We're going to be back to talk about it all. Hey, keep the faith, keep the dog shirts. We're going to get through this. We're one day down and we're still standing. It's going to be okay, people.